A Long Walk to Water, Chapter 14. The story so far. As the drilling crew works hard, Naya thinks it's funny that they have to keep getting water from the pond to find water. It takes a year and a half of walking, but with Salva leading the way, he and the other boys finally arrive in Kenya. Southern Sudan, 2009. For 3 days, the air around Naya's home was filled with the sound of the drill. On the third afternoon, Naya joined the other children gathered around the drill site. The grown-ups rose from their work pounding rocks and drifted over too. The workers seemed excited. They were moving quickly as their leader called out orders. Then whoosh! A spray of water shot high into the air. This wasn't the water that the workers had been piping into the borehole. This was new water, water that was coming out of the hole. Everyone cheered at the sight of the water. They all laughed at the two workers who had been operating the drill. They were drenched, their clothes completely soaked through. A woman in the crowd began singing a song of celebration. Naya clapped her hands along with all the other children. But as she watched the water spraying out of the borehole, Naya frowned. The water wasn't clear. It was brown and heavy-looking. It was full of mud. Ifo Refugee Camp, Kenya, 1992 to 1996. Salva was now 22 years old. For the past 5 years, he had been living in refugee camps in northern Kenya. First at the Kakuma camp, then at Ifo. Kakuma had been a dreadful place, isolated in the middle of a dry, windy desert. Tall fences of barbed wire enclosed the camp. No one was allowed to leave unless you were leaving for good. It felt almost like a prison. 70,000 people lived at Kakuma. Some said it was more, 80 or 90,000. There were some families who had managed to escape together, but again, as in Ethiopia, most of the refugees were orphan boys and young men. The local people who lived in the area did not like having the refugee camp there. They would often break in and steal from the refugees. Sometimes fights would break out and people were hurt or killed. After 2 years of misery at Kakuma, Salva decided to leave the camp. He had heard of another refugee camp far to the south and west, where he hoped things would be better. Once again, Salva and a small group of other young men walked for months. But when they reached the camp at Ifo, they found that things were no different than at Kakuma. Everyone was always hungry, and there was never enough food. Many were sick or injured from their long, terrible journeys to reach the camp. The few medical volunteers could not care for everyone who needed help. Salva felt fortunate that at least he was in good health. He wanted desperately to work, to make a little money that he could use to buy extra food. He even dreamed of saving some money so he could one day leave the camp and continue his education somehow. But there was no work. There was nothing to do but wait. Wait for the next ration of food. Wait for news of the world outside the camp. The days were long and empty. They stretched into weeks, then months, then years. It was hard to keep hope alive when there was so little to feed it. A rumor was spreading throughout the camp. It began like a whisper, but soon Salva felt as if it were a roar in his ears. He could think of nothing else. America? The United States? The rumor was that about 3,000 boys and young men from the refugee camps could be chosen to go live in America. Salva could not believe it. How could it be true? How would they get there? Where would they live? It was impossible. But as the days went by, he learned that the rumor was true. They only want healthy people. If you are sick, you won't be chosen. They won't take you if you have ever been a soldier with the rebels. Only orphans are being chosen. If you have any family left, you have to stay here. Weeks passed, then months. One day a notice was posted at the camp's administration tent. It was a list of names. If your name was on the list, it meant that you had made it to the next step, the interview. After the interview, you would go to America. Salva's name was not on the list, nor was it on the next list, or the one after that. Many of the boys being chosen were younger than Salva. Perhaps America doesn't want anyone too old, he thought. Each time a list was posted, Salva's heart would pound as he read the names. He tried not to lose hope. At the same time, he tried not to hope too much. Sometimes he felt he was being torn in two by the hoping and the not hoping. One windy afternoon, a man Salva knew came rushing to find him. "Salva, come quickly. Your name is on the list today." Salva leapt to his feet and was running even before his friend had finished speaking. When he drew near the administration tent, he slowed down and tried to catch his breath. He might be wrong. It might be another person named Salva. I won't look too soon. From far away, I might see a name that looks like mine, and I need to be sure. Salva shouldered his way through the crowd until he was standing in front of the list. He raised his head slowly and began reading through the names. There it was. Salva Dute, Rochester, New York. Salva was going to New York. He was going to America. Chapter 15. The Stories So Far. Whoosh! Water finally shoots out of the borehole in Naya's village, but it's brown and heavy looking. Having lived in refugee camps for 11 years now, 22-year-old Salva is ecstatic when he finds he has been chosen to go to America. Southern Sudan, 2009. Even though the water spraying out of the borehole was brown and muddy, some of the little boys wanted a drink right away, but their mothers held them back. The men kept on working with their drill. Their leader talked to Naya's uncle and father and some of the other village men. Later, Naya's brother Depp explained things to her. "Don't worry," he said. "The water is muddy because it is still mixed with the old water that they were using from the pond. They have to drill further down to make sure of getting deep enough into the good, clean water underground. And then they have to put in the pipes and make a foundation with the gravel and then install the pump and pour cement around it, and the cement has to dry. It would be several more days before they could drink the water," Depp said. Naya sighed and picked up the big plastic can. Yet another walk to the pond. Nairobi, Kenya, and Rochester, New York, 1996. The Lost Boys. That was what they were being called in America. The boys who had lost their homes and families because of the war and had wandered lost for weeks or months at a time before reaching the refugee camps. The aid worker, a white woman, explained this to Salva and the 8 other boys he would be traveling with. The woman spoke English, which the boys could understand only a little. Sometimes she tried a word or two in Arabic, but she did not speak that language well. It was difficult trying to guess what she meant with only a word or two to hang on to, and Salva worried when he could not understand. They rode in a truck from the Afo refugee camp to a processing center in Nairobi, the capital city of Kenya. Endless forms had to be filled out. Their photos were taken. There was a medical examination. It was all a blur to Salva, for he was too excited to sleep, which made him too tired to understand everything that was happening. But there was one clear moment, when Salva was given new clothes. Underwear, socks, sneakers, a pair of long pants, a t-shirt, and a long-sleeve shirt to wear on top of it. And he was to wear all of these clothes at the same time. "It's winter in America," the aid worker said. "Winter?" Salva repeated. "Yes, very cold. You'll be given more clothes in New York." "More clothes?" Salva shook his head. "How can I possibly wear any more clothes?" Salva could hardly believe his eyes when he boarded the plane in Nairobi. Every person had their own seat, and they all had luggage, too. With all these people, hundreds of heavy padded chairs, and all those bags, how would the plane ever get off the ground? Somehow it did, not like a bird lifting off lightly with a quick wing flap, but with shrieks and roars from the engines as the plane lumbered down the long runway, as if it had to try as hard as it could to get into the air. Once the plane was safely aloft, Salva stared at the scene outside the small window. The world was so big, yet everything in it was so small. Huge forests and deserts became mere patches of green and brown. Cars crawled along the roads like ants in a line, and there were people down there, thousands of them, but he could not see a single one. "Would you like a drink?" Salva looked up at the woman in her neat uniform and shook his head to show that he did not understand. She smiled. "Coca-Cola? Orange juice?" Coca-Cola! Long ago, Salva's father had once brought a few bottles of Coca-Cola back from a trip to the market. Salva's first taste had been startling, all those bubbles jumping around in his mouth. What a rare treat it had been. "Coca-Cola, thank you," Salva said, and with each sip he remembered his family gathered together, passing the bottles from hand to hand, laughing at the tickly bubbles, sharing and laughing together. The journey to Salva's new home would require not 1, not 2, but 3 planes altogether. The first plane flew from Nairobi to Frankfurt in a country called Germany. It landed with an alarming thump, then braked so hard that Salva was thrown forward in his seat. The strap across his stomach caught him hard. He took a second plane from Frankfurt to New York City. It too landed abruptly, but Salva was ready this time and held tightly to the armrests. In New York City, the aid worker led the boys to different gates. They would be making the final leg of the trip alone or in groups of 2 or 3. Salva was the only one going to Rochester. The aid worker said that his new family would be waiting for him there. On the plane to Rochester, most of the passengers were men traveling on their own. But there were some women too, and a few families, mothers and fathers and children. Salva tried not to stare, but he couldn't help studying the families closely. Thoughts kept looping through his mind over and over. What if my new family isn't there? What if they have changed their minds? What if they meet me and they don't like me? Salva took a deep breath. "A step at a time," he reminded himself. "Just this flight to get through for now." The plane landed at last, its wheels screeching, while Salva gripped the armrest and braced himself for what was to come. There they were, smiling and waving in the airport lobby. Salva's new family. Chris the father, Luis the mother, and 4 children, Salva would have siblings just as he had before. He felt his shoulders relax just a little on seeing their eager smiles. Salva said "hello" and "thank you" many times, for these were the only words he felt sure about. He could not understand what anyone was saying, especially Luis, who spoke so quickly that at first he was not sure she was even speaking English. And yes, they did have more clothes for him. A big down jacket, a hat, a scarf, and some gloves. He put on the jacket and zipped it up. The sleeves were so bulky that he felt as if he couldn't move his arms properly. He wondered if he looked very foolish now, with his body and arms so fat and his legs so thin. But none of the family laughed at him, and he soon noticed that they were all wearing the same kind of jacket. The glass doors of the airport terminal slid open. The frigid air hit Salva's face like a slap. When he inhaled, he thought his lungs would surely freeze solid and stop working. But all around him, people were still walking and talking and moving about. Apparently, it was indeed possible to survive in such cold temperatures, and he now understood the need for the awkward, puffy jacket. Salva stood still inside the terminal doors for a few moments. Leaving the airport felt like leaving his old life forever, Sudan, his village, his family. Tears came to Salva's eyes, perhaps from the cold air blowing in through the open doors. His new family was already outside. They turned to look at him. Salva blinked away the tears and took his first step into a new life in America.